This is why you should be careful with the kind of person you choose to get married to. So this woman goes by the name Noella, and she happens to be a widow with 5 kids. Moments after her husband died, she took up the responsibility of catering for her kids all alone, and somehow she managed to provide for them and give them a good life. But along the line, the burden became too much on her. So in an attempt to better her life and that of her kids, Noella applied for a visa to go to Australia. At least in Australia, she would have the government's help. And luckily, she got this visa. So this was how Noella and her 5 kids left Burundi and traveled to Australia to begin a new life. After Noella arrived in Australia, she applied for refugee status. For those who don't know, whenever you apply for refugee status in developed countries and it gets approved, you'd be enrolled in an organization called a resettlement agency. Now, the job of this agency is to help you, the refugee, settle down into the country and also provide you with some basic amenities. So in the case of Noella, her application for refugee status was approved and the agency provided her with a place to stay, a job, and also a social worker she can talk to whenever she's experiencing any difficulty in the country. But there was a little problem. Now, Noella is a Swahili speaker. She doesn't understand English that well, and because of that, whenever she had complaints she wanted to tell the social worker or agency, it was always an issue to get her exact points across. But luckily, along the line, Noella met a man called Kalala in that same agency that solved this language barrier issue for her. Now, Kalala happens to be a Togolese who relocated to Australia after he lost his wife and kids to an attack by rebels in Togo. After relocating, just like Noella, Kalala applied for the refugee status, and after it was approved, he was posted to the same resettlement agency as Noella. So one day, while Noella was struggling to pass her points across as usual to the social worker, Kalala came and made things easier for her. Noella spoke to Kalala in Swahili and told him what she wanted to complain about. Then Kalala, who understood Swahili, translated to English so the social worker could understand. So from time to time, this was how Kalala was helping Noella translate. And over time, they became friends. From friends, they became closer friends. And from there, they began a relationship. A few years later, they got married, bought a house together, and Noella gave birth to 3 additional kids for Kalala, making her a mother of 8 kids in total, 5 from her previous marriage. And everything was going well for them until one day. On that day, Noella received a phone call that her stepmother in the village had just died. And as expected, she was beyond heartbroken. A few months later, a funeral date was set for Noella's stepmother. And as one of the surviving daughters, Noella had to be present at this funeral. So this was how Noella flew from Australia back to Burundi. She lodged in a hotel and stayed there until the day of the funeral. The day of the funeral came and it was a successful one. After the funeral, Noella returned back to her hotel, but she was exhausted. I mean, we all know how exhausting African funerals are, especially when you are related to the deceased, like you go cook food tire. So when Noella arrived at the hotel, she called Kalala, her husband, telling him how tired she was and that she just wants to lie down and sleep off. However, Kalala suggested that she go for a walk and relieve herself of the stress before lying down. So Noella agreed. She came down from her room and was walking around the hotel premises just as her husband had advised. However, a few minutes later, as Noella was walking, she was approached by a man. The man pointed a gun to her face and told her that if she screamed, he would kill her right there, and that even though the gun sound would garner attention and people would come and arrest him, he would still be alive. However, she would be dead. So Noella, scared for her life, agreed to remain quiet. Then the man took her to a car that was already parked by the side of the road. Inside the car were 2 other men. One was in the driver's seat and the other one was at the back. It was a 3-man operation. As Noella was brought into the car, they covered her face and then they drove off. After driving for about 45 minutes, they arrived at an uncompleted building. In the building, the men tied Noella to a chair, took off her mask, and then they began asking her what she did to offend the person that sent them to kidnap her. However, Noella said she did nothing. In fact, as far as she can remember, she has not offended anyone nor have issues with anybody. And right there, the men revealed that the person who sent them to kidnap and kill her is her husband, Kalala. Noella was confused. In fact, she doubted and called them liars because Kalala is a man she has 3 kids for. A man they've been living together for years now without any major problem. When Noella called them liars, one of the men got angry and slapped her. And then, in order to prove they were telling the truth, they called Kalala on the phone and told him they have Noella. And then right there, Kalala said, kill her. The moment Noella heard his voice, she fainted. A few minutes later, Noella regained consciousness and they further told her that the plan of assassinating her was done on November, 3 months ago. Noella couldn't say anything after hearing all this because at that point, she couldn't believe that the man she has spent years with, the man she has 3 kids with, would try to kill her. In fact, at that point, she thought that would be her last day on earth. But then, the men told her something she wasn't expecting to hear. They told her that they weren't going to kill her because they don't kill women and children. However, they would use her to extort money from Kalala. Meanwhile, Noella's brother, on the other hand, who is staying at the village, was extremely worried because his sister has been missing for almost 2 days and her phone line wasn't reachable. So he went to the police to report a missing person case, but the police requested for $545 to begin an investigation into her disappearance, and Noella's brother unfortunately didn't have that amount. So then he called Kalala and told him the situation on ground. And you know what? Kalala pretended as if he knew nothing about his wife's disappearance, and he even transferred the $545 to Noella's brother so that the police can begin the investigation. But eventually, a few days later, the guys who kidnapped Noella released her. They dropped her in a random empty street. But before they released her, they told Kalala they've killed her and he paid them $7,000 for a job well done. The men also gave Noella evidence which he could use to arrest Kalala, a memory card that contained their conversations with Kalala and also a receipt for the Western Union money transfer they received from Kalala. And finally, they told Noella she has 80 hours to leave Burundi or they would come back and finish the job for real this time. So immediately they dropped off Noella, she booked the next flight and flew back to Australia. When she arrived at Australia, she learned that Kalala went about telling members of their church and also her friends that she had died in a motor accident while traveling to attend her stepmother's funeral in Burundi. He even went as far as fixing a funeral for her. So the day of the funeral came and mourners came to Kalala's house to console him. But what no one knew, including Kalala, was that Noella is still alive. In fact, she came to the funeral event but was sitting in a car just outside the venue and was watching the whole thing. After the funeral and everyone left, Noella stepped out of her car and walked up to Kalala. She said Kalala's first words when he saw her was, "Is it my eyes or are you a ghost?" Because he believed she was dead already, and Noella replied to him saying, "Surprise, I'm still alive." At this point, Kalala began begging Noella to forgive him, but it was too late. She had already called the police. So this was how Kalala was arrested. In court, Kalala at first denied everything, but after Noella presented the memory card those guys gave to her and also the $7,000 payment receipt from Western Union, Kalala couldn't say anything again. In court, Kalala was also asked why he did what he did, and the only reason he gave was that it was the devil. So this was how Kalala was sentenced to 9 years in prison for the attempted murder of his wife. He should be out from prison by now, 2024. I'm Caleb and I've uncovered this case.